Even when we say we're collaborating, usually it's us saying, hey, isn't this a good idea? And while you're holding all your dollars, and the whole community is going, yeah, that's a great idea. But from creating their own ideas to building, what happens in that process is that with the donors in, we eliminate the initiation, we eliminate the innovation because we fund it, and not understanding really the leverage of our money there. And so we're really building it. We might even be hiring them, but we're still paying somebody else to build it. We do the silly things where you go to Africa and work alongside somebody, which is just taking a job away from somebody else at an exorbitantly high rate. But having said all that, and then what happens is they don't maintain it, and it won't grow. And so what do you see all over Africa, in the 22 countries I've been in, literally walked through, is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of buildings that are abandoned and are not finished, or were finished but are soon abandoned. I remember walking by one day with a group, and I asked the guy, because we were kind of trying to figure out how to do some fostering in that community. There was some child abuse, and we were trying, well, what are we going to do? Maybe we could take 5 or 6 kids at a time. We don't want to leave them institutionalized, but we need to get them into a safe place so we can figure out what to do with them. There's perfect house style, they call it it's escaping me, but anyway, it would have been the perfect building. I said, why can't we just use that building? Who built it? It was built by a missionary 10 years ago or something. We can't use it. Why? But the missionaries, are they still around? Or some, me, I'm just thinking, well, who's going to know? And no, it wasn't built for that. It was built for a school. And that's the African mentality.
That's crazy.
It wasn't what we needed. And we can't use it because we didn't build it. And I've seen letters that Africans have written in some of the homes I've stayed in to their former missionary supporters, is, the bicycle you gave me has a flat tire, when are you going to come and fix it? Because that's what enablement does. The roof is leaking on the building you built for us, when are you going to come and fix it? And you look around, though, in healthy portions of the communities, which again I think is about 80% of any community, our houses are in pretty good shape, and they're eating well, and their skin looks good, their hair looks good. There's a tone to their hair that you can tell they're getting the right nutrition. And when I first started, I kind of left this out. I just finally stopped looking at what was wrong and started visiting homes that were working and writing down. I did that after that meeting, and I started to realize that there is a healthy Africa.
Okay. That's good to hear.
So what do you think about Oprah
I feel really sorry for her, and I mean it. She's a joke in Africa, and she spent $100 million to teach 100 kids for that school.
And so what is the state of that school now? I haven't heard about
it. It fell apart because of child abuse, and I wouldn't blame her for that. That's just really bad luck. But it does point toward, the few personalities I've seen as I've traveled through Africa. That's kind of what happens. They'll just spend millions.
Yeah, and Angelina Jolie is getting ready to start starting some program somewhere in Africa.
Yeah, and it really hurts. And let me explain why. I'll take the simple. This is a famous program, so it's going to offend somebody, but there's the heifer. How many of you have heard of the heifer project?
Yes.
Boy, in the villages, they just hate that program.
And why half a cow or a chicken?
Yeah, well, it makes total sense from our view. And you buy goats or milking cows and give them to the people in the village who need them. And they get to milk them and breed them, and it totally makes sense. And you see, as soon as it happens, that the economic level of the community comes up. So I'm thinking, well, that sounds pretty good. It's a 3 to 5 year decline. And what happens when you do that is you've infused, even in Africa, a cow might be worth, I'm going to say $100 to $500. It's a valuable asset. It's how wealth is stored in a lot of communities, is in cattle. So you just infuse in a community that might have $1,000 and 6,000 people. You just infused a few $1,000s worth of one single asset, and which is very inflationary, by the way. but you also just put the cattle herder and the goat herder and the milk vendor, and you just put them all out of business. There was an equilibrium in that community. It's probably been in there for 1,000 years, and you just destroyed it. But it looked great. So when the donor was there, and man, you know, you give something to somebody in need, I don't care, they'll take it, you know. It looks good. But what happens then is when the donor leaves or the oversight fades, and those programs particularly, it happens within about 6 months generally, because the donor's mission is finished. They'll come in and they'll make sure that the cattle are put to the right families and give them a little bit of training and stuff. As soon as they leave, you know, there's no support for a system of care. So first of all is disease is a problem, and proper care.
And feeding it.
Feeding is a huge problem. The elders will come in, and, or the uncles or family members, and take the animals away. At some point, they're gone. I haven't found one yet where 2 years later it was still there.
Mm.
The community at large is incredibly resentful of those programs because the community at large doesn't benefit at all, except to get put out of business in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
But the donors don't see that. But the worst part is that when the commodity is gone, the community settles back. But the support system that was there before you infuse that commodity is gone. So it goes down farther. And then the donor comes back and goes, oh my God, they really need help now. Let's do it again. And what happens? It comes up and then it goes down a little farther. And it goes down. And that's 50 years of Africa right there. There's a belief system and leadership issues in Africa too that is completely false. And white people run most of the donor systems in Africa. Most donor programs benefit economically the countries that give the money far more than they do the recipient country. And unknown to most people that the US and Britain especially have trade agreements with those countries that say, we'll give you that money, but you have to buy our products. Which means it's hugely inflationary. It creates huge national debt at the country level, and again compounds that poverty problem. So what I feel like where we're at today, we've been hugely successful in what we've done so far. I'm concerned right now a little bit because I see some drift in our training. Among, you know, we're now in 11 countries. We'll be in 13 by the end of the year. 2,000 villages. The replication is very accurate within the villages, but I see in our leadership, as they see it grow, you know, it's pretty hard. Africa's really big, and it's hard to just fly around Africa, by the way. I can actually fly from here to Nairobi faster than I can fly from West Africa to East Africa, because you can't just go there like that. Mm-hmm. And so communications are difficult. I'm sensing a little. The thing I just described to you works 5 times out of 7, and it works perfectly or not at all. But there's a lot of other needs, and even our leaders succumb to it. They'll come in and there'll be a huge problem with drug abuse, or there'll be an issue like FGM that they'll have a particular passion about solving. And they'll use the materials as a gateway to attack those problems, and then it fails. Because the gateway should come through the people who are in the community. And they will ultimately decide the right thing. It's amazing to me how powerful that process is. And it's becoming a little bit political, which also concerns me. But to your point, and this is particularly an African thing. I've been into India and down all through South America, but particularly an African problem with the Grameen program. And that is, in Africa, it's about 98% successful, which sounds great. You hear that all over the place. But 2 things have happened. One is that what they're measuring is the repayment of the loan. I went into 100 communities about 3 years ago and measured the success rate of the businesses that they funded and found that it wasn't any different than the businesses that weren't getting funded. Because I wanted to see if it was time for us to do it. So I decided, no, we don't want to do that right now. But I don't think it's not necessary, so don't get me wrong. Because it is a really well-designed program.
And it's a bank.
Yeah, but it is a bank. And they're measuring their success as a repayment, which any bank should do. The other problem, though, it's not Grameen. It's what's happened to the concept, which is it's now become one of the most usurious programs in the world. the average interest rate, private people do it in Africa. One of the biggest is the Presbyterian Church of East Africa. They had to actually form a separate corporation, it got so big. And they charge 20% to 30%. So the businesses can't sustain that interest rate.
No.
But they still, and you'll understand this because there's a design of the Grameen program. We call it a circle in our groups. But the circle basically might be 7 to 10 people. And they'll each have gotten $20 or something. I mean, you have to be people that have been successful doing some little project before. And so they'll get together. And every person in the circle is responsible for everybody else's loans. So it's like a huge cross-collateral system. But in those communities, to fail to pay back the loan would be a huge disgrace and loss of face. So the loans are always repaid. They'll beg, borrow, steal, whatever they have to do, those loans get repaid. That's why it's so successful. The problem, of course, with that is that it doesn't necessarily, the focus is now shifted to the wrong thing.
Right.
You can't not shift that focus, by the way. But because of the corruption in Africa, partly, and partly because it's so deregulated, you can't, and Africans are not generally well educated in economics. It's just been a massive Ponzi scheme for collecting huge amounts of money. So we're trying to figure that element out because there's a point where, America was built on capital and consumerism. My view is that until people around the world earn enough to buy more stuff than they need to live on, to survive on, to get above subsistence, you'll never change poverty. So, because you have to create a consumer. We've been able to come up, I'd say, they're 1,000% better than where we start, but they're only up to the poverty line.
Right.
And what I'm not sure about next is, see, I'd love them to stay in the village. The huge migration now is to the cities because there's a perception that there's work there, and there's not. That's what starts the whole disease cycle, and that now extends from Mombasa down the lunatic highway down all the way to Cape Town. That's the AIDS corridor of East and Central South Africa. We have to. I don't want to industrialize the place because they actually have capacity to take care of themselves in a very traditional way that's very healthy. And if it didn't matter if they went to the city, I'd be fine with that. But it matters a lot. An orphan in a good orphanage in Africa will still have lost their tribal identity. They will not have any ancestral rights, and they will not be able to get a job when they get out of their orphanage, no matter how high class the orphanage is. And they will be on the street at the end of that process, virtually 100% of the time. So we're compounding problems by allowing and supporting programs. And in other programs, the child feeding programs are notoriously corrupt. And just notoriously corrupt. And in the book, the first book, when I first wrote it, I included all that. I named names. I was like, boom, boom, boom. And the guys that were helping me edit it made me take all that out. Just state the facts.
So tell us again. You said you charge $20 for this, and what does the money go for?
100% of that goes to village care.
Okay.
And all of our
in what
money,
capacity does it go to village care?
Well, we have no U.S. staff. So
You what?
We have no U.S. staff.
Oh, okay.
So everybody in the U.S. that does anything for village care is a volunteer. We have one paid person in each country that we work in Africa, and it funds that and transportation and training. It does not fund publications and materials because we found the communities don't need it.
Okay.
So that opus that I sent you, the training guide, there are only 13 of those in Africa, one for each main leader. We might publish a few more of those, but every dollar goes. And we do have some lending programs too that were started about 3 years ago. 3 countries they've worked well, and 2 countries they haven't worked well. So we're working that out.
You mentioned that. Sorry, you mentioned the child mortality rate has gone down with village care.
Yeah.
What about the orphans? What's happening?
Well, that's who we measure. So we're not measuring every kid that's.
But I mean, are they being cared for? Are they going to orphanages? What?
No, we do everything we can to keep them out of an orphanage. What we do, remember the third point is that we want every child to be safe, healthy, living in a loving home.
Okay.
So what we're doing in that training process is preparing the concept of a loving home that kid can be brought into. And not funding that kid has turned out, frankly, it was a necessity for us. We're working with 150,000 kids now. and you just can't fund that unless you're just going to start another Feed the Children
Right.
welfare program. But what it does do is creates a environment where that kid is now equal to the other kids in the home. And it's interesting because in communities we run across, well, I'm not going to name them, but 2 or 3 other programs where there'll be children being fed in that community. Even the UN now recognizes that a home is better than an orphanage, no matter how bad the home is. Even an abusive home, they found, is better than an orphanage. So we all kind of agree that in America we stopped doing orphanages decades ago because of the same problem. Kids need to be in a home. They need parenting figures. And I don't know why it started to work as much as the fact that I think there is a truth to just walking into a community and turning on the light, saying, look, you can take care of these kids. Now, let's do a program together, and you can figure out how you're going to do that. And they do. And they could have been doing it all along. And of course, you can ask, well, why wouldn't they do it before? 200 years of being told you can't do anything unless somebody comes and tells you what to do. And they live in fear of that. You can tell when we do the Opus program on that first day, when we ask that first question, there's this dead silence usually. They're just looking at you like, well, are we allowed to speak? They're looking for permission to do something. And finally somebody will say something and bam, it just takes off. Because they just realize, well, you mean we can just speak for ourselves? And then they'll do something. And all the things that they thought they were waiting for that they needed, in fact, they can find in their own community. Rich soil, usually there's plenty of water. That's sort of a myth. If you took a crisis view of Africa, the truth is, in civil war crisis, that might affect 1% of the population. It gets 90% of the coverage. Badlands, Western Kenya, the real problem with that is that the government of Kenya won't take the food that's 20% of the food grown in Western Kenya goes to waste, and they won't just take it to the other side of the country. So I refuse to bend to that. I'm not going to send food to a place where there's a drought when they could be sending their own.
Well, we saw a lot of that in Half the Sky, because all the heroes in that movie were all local
Yeah, and that's
people who
because
were
that's
doing
who the
amazing things.
It's good to hear because
Yeah, the
that's
hospital and the other
well,
businesses,
everything
small
we've seen that
businesses,
the
women
community's
created.
built has sustained itself. Everything we built, I can point to the things I built.
And David, I think your point is really well made, and I think that doing what you're doing, I know there's always an inclination because we are people of self-determination to grow it, make it bigger, expand it, and constantly move it. And we've all seen what constant upward growth can do. At some point, there's a kind of madness attached to it, as opposed to doing that core thing beautifully over and over. Because when you talk about, we crazy Americans who want to come in with a new idea, our crazy American thing is that divine self-destiny thing that we have. It's one of the most unique things that comes out of the United States and out of the first world as it's developing now.
Right.
When you walk into what we call an underdeveloped world, and I'm not sure that's an appropriate thing to call it. It happens to just be a different world, because development is a completely arbitrary thing and very personal. You go into those places where colonialism and where there has been literally so many generations where your self-initiative has been pounded out of people. Maybe they've never even really had an opportunity to ever even develop it. It is a shocking thing to have somebody say, what are you going to do? I can remember being in Europe after the war, after World War II, and they were in that similar sort of place. The only thing that they had was that they leaned back into their ancient cultures and said, but once we were great. And so now we can start to take these little steps forward to say nothing of the fact that we were there commanding them to move forward. But you go into Asia, you go into Africa, you go into parts of Latin America today, and it's not as extreme necessarily as what you see in Africa, but that's the key issue. And the point that you are doing, and why I applaud it so sincerely, is forget all that other stuff. This is about starting at the basic thing, which is you can.
Yeah, I just wanted to find what I could do and stop worrying about what I couldn't do.
And because you have you can.
One of the
statements you made in your book, what is it, arrogance wrapped in kindness or something
Yeah,
like that?
it is.
Which
it
is,
And you
I think it's
about-
really true
and
too. We
this is the
think we're
only-
gonna save.
Well, it's
Well,
ignorance.
This is
to
the only
everything.
group I've spoken to in 2 years, and I stopped speaking to groups because it's really hard, in my view, to accept people's view of what giving is really about. And it's really about, and of course, it's not true of anybody in this room, of course, but it's about if it makes me feel good or not.
No,
Exactly.
that is a
And-
very basic truth,
Yeah.
though. I mean, I
Yeah,
think a lot of
and-
people don't realize how selfish, where they're coming from.
Yeah, and of course, my view is, that makes Americans the current perpetrators of death around the world, because in our kindness, we're killing millions of children. Here's the ultimate proof, and it's a statistical proof, that by any measure, 50 years of economic studies in Africa indicate that disease rates are up, child mortality rates are up, economic measure per capita is down, and lifespans are down. That's the result of 50 years of donor involvement. And there is no area where that's not true. Africa is worse today than it's ever been.
I thought it was because of the colonialism was gone and they had lost touch with what they had been taught for
Yeah,
thousands of
maybe,
years.
maybe.
So all of a sudden all the whites have moved out and now we're supposed to be on our own. So
Well,
how much did that
maybe that would have been true for a generation, but in fact, the first generation did well. So,
Okay.
see what I'm saying? So there's obviously more to it than that. What we've created is a massive welfare program, which impacts just enough of the population that the rest of the population won't work. And what I don't want to do is give them what we have. I want to enhance who they are. I believe that the abusive traditions, in fact, FGM comes from India. The food of Africa, and by different words, is ugali. It's called different things in different countries. But it's a mashed corn meal. It's cheap to make. It has no flavor whatsoever, and they just cannot live without it. It was introduced by the British when they built the railroad. It is not an African tradition. In fact, British introduced corn. And so we have all these myths about what traditions are. I like to point out, when I don't do it anymore because we don't talk about tradition, but they'll all talk about, oh, we can't change this because that's tradition. And I point to well, how come that guy's got a tin roof on his hut? I'm counting, looking out over the horizon.
Right.
And everybody that can afford it has a tin roof. Is that tradition? Oh, no.
We had a similar scene, if you guys remember, if you saw both parts of the movie. They were talking to a cutter, a woman with 15 children
Right.
to support, and
Right.
she
That's
said,
right.
and they said, if you had some other way to make money, would you do something
Absolutely.
else? And she
Yeah.
said, absolutely,
You bet.
I would. I'm not stuck on this. This is not,
Yeah.
it's a tradition,
Tradition is the
and it's to
great excuse.
chastise our girls,
Mhm.
keep them safe, whatever that means.
Well, we could
And-
spend hours on
Yeah.
how the politics in the village work around female genital mutilation are really interesting, because it does empower certain parts of the village and disempowers others.
Right. Male,
And the great,
female maybe?
well, a little bit, but
I also
interestingly
wanna-
enough, it